ever wondered what happens inside the mind of a child who is constantly ignored? Not abused, not shouted at, but simply unseen. A child whose tears are overlooked, whose achievements are unnoticed, and whose feelings are dismissed as if they don't matter. Many people believe that physical harm is the deepest wound a child can experience, but psychology tells us something different. Sometimes the deepest scars are invisible. They are created by silence, emotional absence, and neglect. A child doesn't just need food, clothes, or a roof over their head. They need to feel seen, heard, and emotionally safe. When that need is repeatedly ignored, it shapes the way they think, love, trust, and even see themselves for the rest of their lives. Research consistently shows that emotional neglect can disrupt emotional, cognitive, and social development, even when physical needs are met. The famous British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott once said that a child doesn't need a perfect parent, they need a good enough parent. His idea was simple but powerful. Children grow emotionally when caregivers are consistently responsive, even if they occasionally make mistakes. But when a caregiver is emotionally absent most of the time, the child begins to feel as though their emotions have no value. Over time, they stop expressing them altogether. Imagine a little boy excitedly running to show his mother a drawing. She's busy scrolling through her phone. Later, she says, without looking. The next day, he tells his father about something funny that happened at school. His father barely listens. A week later, he stops sharing. Months later, he stops trying. Years later, he becomes an adult who struggles to believe anyone truly cares what he thinks. This is how emotional neglect often begins, not with cruelty, but with repeated indifference.
Psychologists call this emotional neglect, and unlike physical abuse, it often leaves no visible evidence, yet its effects can last for decades. Children naturally look to their parents to understand who they are. When parents consistently respond with warmth, attention, and comfort, children develop a secure sense of self. But when those responses are missing, children often conclude, if no one notices me, maybe I don't matter. One of the most important theories explaining this process comes from John Bowlby's attachment theory. Bowlby argued that children build internal working models based on their earliest relationships. If caregivers are emotionally available, children learn that the world is safe and relationships are trustworthy. If caregivers repeatedly ignore them, they may develop insecure attachment, leading to anxiety, avoidance, or difficulty trusting others throughout life. The tragedy is that ignored children often become invisible adults. Some become people pleasers. They spend their lives trying to earn love because they never felt worthy of it as children. They become the friend who always says yes, the employee who never complains, or the partner who sacrifices everything just to avoid being abandoned. Others take the opposite path. They build emotional walls. They convince themselves they don't need anyone. They appear strong and independent, but deep inside they fear rejection so much that they avoid closeness altogether. Both behaviors come from the same wound. Another fascinating psychological concept comes from Alfred Adler, the Austrian psychiatrist, who believed that every child has a deep desire to belong. Adler argued that when children feel insignificant or overlooked, they often develop what he called feelings of inferiority. Throughout adulthood, many spend their lives trying to compensate for that hidden sense of not being enough. Some chase success obsessively, others seek constant approval, a few withdraw completely, believing they can never truly belong. Have you ever met someone who apologizes for everything, even when they've done nothing wrong? Or someone who constantly doubts compliments, assuming people don't really mean them? These behaviors often have roots in childhood experiences where emotional validation was missing. Modern neuroscience also supports these psychological theories.
Studies show that chronic emotional neglect during childhood can influence how the brain responds to stress. The systems responsible for regulating fear, emotions, and social connection may become overly sensitive or under-responsive. As a result, ignored children often grow into adults who either overreact to rejection or struggle to identify and express their emotions at all. Emotional neglect has also been associated with higher risks of anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and relationship difficulties later in life. Perhaps the saddest part is that many ignored children never realize what happened. Because they weren't physically harmed, they often tell themselves, "My childhood wasn't that bad." They compare themselves to people who experienced obvious abuse and dismiss their own pain. But emotional neglect isn't defined by what happened. It's defined by what never happened. The hugs that never came. The conversations that never happened. The comfort that was never offered. The words, "I'm proud of you," that were never spoken. Psychologists often describe emotional neglect as an absence rather than an event. And because it's an absence, many survivors struggle to explain why they feel empty despite having memories that appear normal. Interestingly, ignored children often become highly observant adults. Since they couldn't rely on adults to understand their feelings, they became experts at reading facial expressions, tone of voice, and subtle emotional changes. They learned to predict moods to protect themselves. While this can make them deeply empathetic, it can also leave them emotionally exhausted because they're constantly monitoring others while ignoring their own needs.
But here's the hopeful truth. The brain remains capable of change throughout life. Psychologists call this neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to form new patterns through healthy relationships, therapy, mindfulness, and repeated positive experiences. Secure friendships, supportive partners, compassionate mentors, and professional counseling can gradually teach the nervous system that connection is safe. Healing doesn't erase childhood, but it changes how childhood shapes the future. Carl Rogers, one of the founders of humanistic psychology, believed that people flourish when they experience genuine acceptance and unconditional positive regard. His work reminds us that healing begins when someone finally feels deeply heard, accepted, and understood. If you recognize yourself in this story, remember this. Being ignored as a child was never proof that you were unworthy of love. It was evidence that the adults around you failed to meet emotional needs every child deserves. Your silence was not weakness. Your loneliness was not your identity. And your need for love was never too much. The ignored child inside many adults is still waiting for someone to notice them. Sometimes that person can finally be you. So the next time you meet a quiet child, a withdrawn teenager, or even an adult who hides behind endless smiles, remember that behind every invisible person may be a child who spent years wondering if anyone would ever truly see them. Because every child deserves more than survival. Every child deserves to be seen.